Good afternoon. I will convene the special meeting of the Board of Commissioners for Monday, February 15th, 2021 at 1 p.m. This meeting is the second in a series of 3 special meetings regarding public works updates. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss water and sewer utility rate setting and the methodologies for calculating them. I'll recognize Hong Lee, Public Works Administrator, for his introductory comments and presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioners, Chairman, management, and everyone else who may be watching for the opportunity to come before you today and talk to you about what's going on in Public Works. This is the second of 3 that we have scheduled, and the first we talked about sort of the projects, and now we're going to really talk about the financing and the rates necessary to support it. So before I get started, I just want to, sort of on the screen in front of you, virtually, as well as staff behind me, we have the leadership of Public Works. So you have on screen, you have Aubrey Lofton, who is in charge of Planning and Resource Management, John Shutak, who took over for Scott Honeycutt once he retired, and so John is the Director of Engineering now. And then you also have Andy Neff, who's in charge of water and wastewater operations, and in person with me is Amy McCaskill, in charge of all the business operations for Public Works. And in addition, you're going to see 3 faces on the screen. Andy Burnham, who works, Andy, Letitia, and Jacob, they all work for basically our financial consultant. That's a company called Stantec, and they run all of our, help us with our financial modeling. And so I have for you, that's not my screen, I have for you a PowerPoint to sort of walk you through sort of what we are doing today. And I'm going to try to collapse that so I can see the screen. In front of you, you have a binder, and it's intimidating because it's full. A lot of it is information that you've requested, and a big chunk of that is the comprehensive annual financial report, which has our information in it as well as the feasibility report and some other things. And in the back, you'll have today's presentation, both from Public Works, as well as the materials that Stantec is going to be sharing with you. And so to members of county management, to the manager and his staff, copies are being made right now, and they'll be with you shortly. So I apologize for not having them ready in advance. So to take you through sort of what we're going to do today, in January we took you through sort of water and sewer and the demand for service, and sort of what our plan was to meet that demand. But mostly we spent a lot of time talking about the capacity constraints we had in the sewer system. And today we're going to talk about sort of the business side of Public Works, and Public Works as an enterprise, because we are not a taxpayer-funded government department. But mostly we're going to spend a lot of time talking about rates, rate setting, and how that works. And so we've asked Andy and his staff to really take us through sort of some material in terms of how those kinds of things get determined, and then really walk you through sort of that last thing, rate model and scenarios, sort of what are the options in front of the Board of County Commissioners, as really the Board of Governors for the water and sewer utility in terms of the decisions you have. And then in March, we'll talk about some other fee and cost-related things to sort of close it out, and then give you a recommendation on sort of what staff would like for the board to do in the best interest of Public Works. And then in April, we're going to be asking you to make decisions on those things. And so that's really the calendar between now and April. And so again, as a business enterprise, Rates 101, as we call it, and then we're going to take you through some of these things. And then, so we'll start, Stantec has the middle 3, and I will close it out with, what would it cost if we did, certain scenarios or options. And so just to walk you through, really, we run like any other business. We have revenue sources, we have operations that we engage in, activities of the business. We have expenditures that the business incurs, and we have customers who we serve to meet. Just to give you a sense of sort of what's all involved in our revenue, most of our revenue comes from the ratepayers. So about $61 million, and these are 2021, fiscal year 2021 numbers. About $61 million comes from our ratepayers. We also collect miscellaneous fees, connection fees, late fees, what have you, and we get a little bit of money from there. And then lastly, we collect system development fees. Now, system development fees are limited in how we can use them, by the basin, by the type. So if we collect a water system development fee, we can only use it on a water capital project. If it's a sewer system development fee, only on a sewer project. If we collect it in the Yadkin Basin, we can only spend it in the Yadkin Basin. So there are rules about how we can use system development fees. So even though we show it here at 6.2 million, it's limited in what we can do with it. And then, so we take all that revenue, and then we run the business of public works. We have 150 highly skilled and motivated public servants, and you're actually going to meet one of them today as part of the manager's presentation at the regular board meeting at 3 o'clock. And we do everything from administering the public works enterprise to doing the long-range planning, building and the capital projects, designing them and constructing them, and then we run them, and then lastly, we obviously run the business side of it where we charge for service, and then we begin that process again. So how's that work? So on the expenditure side, 32 million, 33 million almost, goes for operations, the day-to-day operations of public works, everything from salaries to gas to utilities to paper, pens, paper clips, everything that runs the business on a daily basis. We spend about $10 million paying for debt service, all the long-term debt associated with the capital infrastructure that we put in the ground. And then lastly, we have capital projects, and the number that I'm showing you here is what this board and all the prior boards have appropriated year-to-date, plus the 5-year forecast. And so, we got some projects in our long-range plan. And then lastly, we provide service to about 52,000, almost 53,000 water accounts and almost 39,000 sewer accounts. And that really, sort of in a very quick nutshell, is the business of public works. And as we think about that, and what I showed you was just a one-year snapshot, we also think about long-term, the future. And this is why we are having these sessions with the Board of County Commissioners. So we use the comprehensive plan that comes out of the planning department, whatever town plans are available to inform our thinking about the future. We obviously put together a 10-year master plan, and in March, when we have that meeting at the Ag Center, we're actually going to talk to you about the master plan process for public works. And we also do a multi-year capital planning so that we can sort of start scheduling projects when we think they need to happen in order to maintain the system. And on an annual basis, we build the annual capital budget and the annual operating budget, and that goes through the regular county process for building those things. And then obviously, our costs to maintain and replace, manage inflow and infiltration, to maintenance of our systems, we take all of those things into account as we try to plan for the future. And then all of this planning, all this data, all this information gets sort of input into our financial model to try to figure out what is the best balance between the things we need to do, would like to do, and how we pay for those things. And I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of just some of the variables that goes into the financial modeling. And this is why we engage a group like Stantec and Andy and his folks to help us with it. So we are, water customers, water usage growth, debt coverage, bond, cash flow, price elasticity, affordability, debt, these are just some of these things, escalation factors. So, it's not like we just pick a number, put it in, then we move on. It's like when you look at this thing, these are all interrelated. So when you change operating expense, then you got to go back and figure out what impact that has on your budget. When you change your budget, then you got to go figure out, well, what impact does that have on your ability to pay back your debt? Well, now you got to look at your bond covenants. Now you got to look at, well, how many customers can we serve if we have that much money? Or do we need more money? What happens if your sewer capacity is limited? What effect does that have on your customers? So all these variables sort of, they interact with each other. And so we built a very complicated model to try to understand all of this. Fortunately for us, we can make Andy talk about it rather than us. But I wanted to give you some context of sort of, how we got to where we are. And so I'm showing you the 21st century, public works since 2001. And what you're seeing in 2001 through fiscal year 2011 is not a mistake. There were no rate increases for that entire decade. In fact, we only show 2001, but if you go back to 1996, there were no rate increases in terms of the customer water and sewer rates since 1996. And so in 2012, it's really the thinking behind the need for a water plant and a second source of water started, sort of materializing and becoming a reality. And we started thinking about what it would take to afford and to finance and to build. That's when you started getting the rate increases starting in 2012. And so you got about 6.5 to 3.5 to 6.5, all the way through 2020, and then obviously the last 2 years are the 15.5% rate increases. And so we are right here at calendar year 2022. And so one of the decisions we're going to be asking of you in April is setting the rates for the next, I just call it the next 3-year period, so that we can continue to provide service to our customers and to the community. And I thought this was important to show you. This is data from Stantec that they put together. So as you look at the blue line, what you're seeing is a water and sewer cumulative consumer price index. So this is the rate at which costs have increased since 2001 in the, I'll call it the water and sewer utility business in that industry. And you can see that the prices or the cost of running the business between 2001 and 2020 have increased almost 175%. For public works, if you look at our rates, you can see the zeros going all the way through, and we just put it through 2020. You can see we have not kept up with inflation. And there's a lot of ways to read that. And one of the ways to read that is we're better than your average utility in terms of how efficient we are. So we're able to provide the services and, frankly, the high level of service that we do with fewer rate increases simply because we think we're better than the average utility. And I think this, in part, shows you that. The other thing is we haven't kept up with inflation, and so the area between the two curves is really lost revenue to public works. And so part of the, the need for the 15.5% was in part to make up for some of the lost revenue so we can afford to finance the water plant and do some other things. And so what you're seeing in the dotted lines are future trends and what went into the financial feasibility study. And so we're actually going to talk to you about that red dotted line. Everything that Andy built into the financial feasibility study, what we call the baseline model for public works, is that red line. And it shows you shows sort of rates going up at 2.5% a year, whereas the projection for CPI is on a somewhat steeper curve than that. So when we look at the rate model, it really is an iterative process. We set the rates, hypothetically, what would happen if we did this? How much revenue does that generate? What can we afford to do? Is that enough? Is it too high? And so we do this iteratively, and I can tell you that we've gone through many rounds with Stantec in terms of looking at various scenarios and seeing how rates impact our revenues, impact service, which impacts rates, so going back and forth, trying to build a model that makes sense for us. Some of the things that we have taken into account in terms of assumptions is the growth in our customer base, the demands for service and what we think will happen to demand for service in the future, what it will cost to operate public works, and when we think these capital projects need to occur. And we call that the baseline scenario. And so at this point, I want to introduce to you again Andy Burnham. He is the Vice President of Financial Services at Stantec. And the team that's been working with us is Letitia and Jacob, and so those three make up the Stantec team for us. And we have asked a lot of them, and they have risen to every challenge that we've thrown at them. It doesn't matter how complicated the question, they've always managed to find us an answer. They have been working with us since 2017. They've done the revenue bond feasibility study. They've also helped us with our rate modeling. They've done the system development fee and the current cost of service analysis, many of these things which they're going to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy, and let you share your screen and walk everyone through the materials that you have.
That's perfect. Thank you, Hung. And if you could just let me know when the presentation comes through on your end.
It's up.
Excellent. So I appreciate the introduction and thank you for the time and attention, commissioners, as well as members of the administration. I did want to go through just a tiny bit about Stantec's financial services. As Hung made you aware of our services with the county for the past few years, we provide the same types of services to communities throughout the country, more than 360 and really growing. Worked with about 20 or so communities now in North Carolina. This graphic's a tiny bit dated on that point, but our group, Leticia, Jacob, myself, and about 35 others really focus on utility financial management issues, developing sustainable business plans, cost allocation, and rate structures and pricing mechanisms. So it's very much something near and dear to our heart, and it's what we specifically focus on at Stantec. So one of the things that we sometimes do as part of providing our services is just having a bit of an education session about the rate-making process itself and what goes into it. And one of the things I often like to start with is just a bit of perspective in terms of what the national landscape looks like for utility costs across the country. This is done by the circle of blue. It's a few years old now, but it shows that for a family of 4 using 100 gallons a day per person, what the cost of water, sewer, and in some cases stormwater services are. And for whatever reason, they decided not to put Union County in this map, but we went ahead and added you in so that you could have a sense of perspective. And I think it's important to understand that we're in a very moderate cost environment in North Carolina as opposed to other parts of the country that have significantly greater cost of materials and construction, water scarcity concerns that really drive their cost requirements. But each one of these utilities is really facing, to different degrees, the same types of challenges, some of which Hung really alluded to just a moment ago for your utility system. There's been a couple of big macro level trends that we really haven't seen any utility escape from as part of their financial planning process, and they've really had to reconcile those things. And there's the Union County graphic that I mentioned. The things that they're having to deal with are really around the demand for services. As water efficiency fixtures continue to come in with new construction or older homes are remodeled, we continue to see reductions in ongoing water use. And at the same point in time, utilities are really seeing increasing needs for infrastructure investment. In some cases, it's replacing aged infrastructure. In other communities, it could be the expansion of capacity to serve a growing customer base. Those two things have really in tandem caused utility rate increases or rate pressures that have outpaced the rate of inflation, generally speaking, since 2008 for most utilities. On average, water and sewer rates, as I was pointing out, go up at about 5% a year across the country. But if you think about the overall rate of inflation that the CPI and the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures, that goes up at about 2 to 2.5% per year. So these combined impacts or drivers, if you will, are causing water and sewer rates to go up at a higher rate than just general inflation for many utilities across the country. And so that's a challenge that they're having to grapple with, and many communities are considering affordability, and really as part of it, trying to make sure that they're leveraging any and all data that they have to make sure that they're allocating cost fairly to all their customers. So some communities have looked at trying to bring new data sets together that previously couldn't be brought together in the past to separate out multifamily customers, to evaluate affordability concerns, and to also really understand customer demand patterns and profiles, not just monthly distributions, but with the advent of technology and advanced metering infrastructure, communities have the ability to actually get daily and even hourly measures of water use from customers that can really help more granularly and more precisely allocate costs than what we could have done in the past. And the process that communities go through and utilities go through for setting rates, generally there's really 4 steps in the process. The first is understanding how much revenue do we need to meet our system requirements. And that's generally done annually for most utility systems and communities as part of the budget process. However, other activities, such as how do we allocate our cost between our different types of customers, how do we price our services in terms of fixed and variable charge structures, and what do we do relative to our cost of service for turn-ons, turn-offs, system development charges, those specific services that are associated with a particular activity or a very specific type of infrastructure, such as expansion, those are really looked at every 3 to 5 years. And in North Carolina with House Bill 436, we now are required to look at system development fees at a minimum once every 5 years, if not more frequently than that. And within each of these elements of the process, there's a different focus for rates. In particular with revenue requirements, the rate focus there is really very fundamental in nature, making sure we identify all of our costs to provide our identified level of service objectives, and also to identify what mechanisms that we want to utilize to recover all of our costs. Is it just rates? Is it system development fees? Those miscellaneous fees that I mentioned? How can we leverage grants, and what should we do relative to debt financing to help try to fund our initial infrastructure? So the revenue requirements is a holistic process of really evaluating our needs and what funding mechanisms do we want to use to satisfy those needs. In the rate and the cost allocation part of the process, the focus here is really on equity between customer classes and a deeper dive into our cost of service. There's some great industry resources out there that can serve as guidance. In some cases, like the American Water Works Association Manual M1, they can also serve as very good cures for insomnia. They're great reference guides that give you good information about best practices, techniques to fairly and equitably allocate costs. But they very specifically state they should be used as guidance, because every utility system is a little bit different, has its own unique challenges, own unique configurations, unique availability of data and systems that have to be taken into consideration as part of the process. But utilities routinely rely upon the practices as evidenced in these manuals as a basis for trying to get to fair and equitable distributions of the revenue by customer classes. So they'll take those methods, apply the ones that are best suited for their circumstances, and make their own unique modifications to those methods to make sure that they can ultimately have allocations of their costs to the different components of the system that can then be allocated to customers based on how they use those different elements of the system. And the whole intent is to be able to establish how much revenue should be collected from each customer class. And so the schematic here on the right is just a really simple bar chart that just shows at the end of the cost allocation process, what you're really wanting to be able to do is understand what is your cost of providing service to customers, and how does that compare to the revenue that you're generating from rates today, so that you can understand what those differences are, and then be able to take steps in the future to potentially make those bars come into more alignment as part of your ongoing rate setting and financial management practices. And part of how you do that goes to really that third element of the process, the rate structure, rate design piece, looking at the different pricing mechanisms that you can apply that will not only achieve those cost of service results that we're looking for, but that can also reflect some of your policies, whether it's fixed cost recovery or revenue stability, promoting conservation, or providing for affordability. One of the things that we like to do is, as part of the conversation, help you understand just how your rate structure compares to some of your neighbors. And so what we did here is plot in a chart of the current, well, I should say fiscal year 20, tier sizes or rate structures that communities use for residential service for water. And so you can see here, only Monroe and Marshville have a single rate that's applied to use, whereas all the other communities have 2, 3, 4, or potentially even 5 tiers of usage levels, where the rates will get progressively higher for the more usage that you have. And so we've identified here the amount of water use in each tier of the inclining block rate structures that entities have within the general geographic area. And then on the next slide, we show, well, what is the price that they charge per 1,000 gallons for water use in each of those tiers? And as I mentioned, you can see again the inclining block rate structure that's really being applied for several communities in the area outside of Monroe and in Marshville. And so you can see the difference in pricing, and we tried to keep the width on these bars to match the amount of volume in each tier, consistent with the prior slide as well. But you again can see that we're generally pretty conforming in the rate structure that we have today relative to having an inclining block rate structure and the number of tiers that we have. and also relative to the pricing of our tiers. They're all generally comparable to the select group of entities that we survey here. We pulled the same information for wastewater rates as well, and it's for wastewater, it's very common to have just a simple uniform rate that's really applied to all use. I know the bars say all excess use, but it's really for all metered water use. A couple of communities, Harrisburg and Mount Pleasant, they actually have 2,000 gallons of use included in their fixed monthly charge. Then they have a rate that applies to all remaining metered water use. Union County and Charlotte Water have caps for how much metered water volumes they will apply their wastewater rates to for residential customers, both at 12,000 gallons. So that's also a practice that we see a pretty even distribution of, if you back outside of this local survey, in terms of entities that will have a cap or those that will not have a cap. Many communities, if they have separate irrigation meters available, may not necessarily offer a sewer cap for residential customers, recognizing that customers could have a separate water-only meter for irrigation purposes if they chose. And looking at the wastewater pricing, as I mentioned, in many cases, it's a uniform rate, with Harrisburg and Mount Pleasant having a rate that kicks in after the amount of water use in the base charge. But you can again see that Union County's rate's very comparable to several of the local agencies. And we took all this and actually took a bigger step back as well and looked at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina's dashboard that captures rate survey information each year. For 2020, it had about 369 utilities in the survey. And if you look at the bottom chart, they looked at median bills in North Carolina based on 5,000 gallons a month for residential service, and commercial at 50,000 gallons. The median bill is $35.98 for 2020. If you looked at Union County's rates in 2020, the bill was $30. And for wastewater, the median was $44.27. In Union County, it was slightly higher than the median at $53. And if you looked at the fixed charges on the top right for the typical water utility, the median fixed charge was $17 a month. That's the flat rate per month that customers would pay regardless of water use. Again, for Union County, a little bit lower than the median on water, and also a little bit lower than the median on sewer as well. And then for commercial, just looking at the bottom for the water bill, very similar to the outcomes for residential, a little bit lower than the median on water for that same usage amount, and a little bit higher on the wastewater side. And so all of this information was very relevant to us in terms of your current rate structure, how you compare in cost to others in the state, but then also the specific analysis of all of your costs as part of the revenue requirements in terms of what we did for a cost of service and rate design evaluation for the county. This process was conducted in 2019 is when it started, using fiscal year 2020 data. And so this process is really focused on these two blocks here. How should costs be allocated to our different customer classes that we have, and what would be potential pricing structure considerations that we may think about, recognizing current customer usage characteristics and industry trends and practices. And I think Hung mentioned this in the beginning of the presentation, but I think it bears repeating that the last time you went through a comprehensive study like this was, I think, a little over 10 years ago now. So I referenced most utilities will go through this process every 3 to 5 years. So this is something that going forward, we might suggest that is looked at more systematically on a little bit more frequent basis than what has been done in the past. But that being said, as I mentioned, the objectives of this type of analysis are really to understand the different costs that comprise our systems so that we can make sure that we allocate those to customers based upon how they contribute to or that they use those systems, to make sure that we can have rates that reflect that proportionality, that they're fair and equitable. The one thing that we have to mention is part of this process, and I think it's important, is that within the county, we don't yet have advanced metering infrastructure data that allows us to know and have actual data observations for customer maximum day and peak hour demands. So we're having to estimate those as part of this process. That's not a new thing to the industry. They've been estimating them for years, but with the advent of technology and plans to do that in the future, I do want to point that out, that the assumptions made in this analysis about those peak demands for the different classes could be updated in the future as that advanced metering infrastructure data becomes available. But the approach we took for this cost of service analysis for you was, quite literally by the book, using the more detailed approach called based extra capacity as identified in AWWA Manual M1. And we went through a process of taking all the costs of your budget for the utility systems and first isolating water from sewer, and then taking those water system costs and breaking them down into which ones were associated with source of supply versus treatment, distribution versus customers, because depending upon the nature of the cost, different customer demands really drive or contribute to those costs. Our source of supply systems, for instance, have to be sized to meet our total demands that customers require of us throughout the entire year. And our treatment plants also have to meet those total demands, but they have to be sized and they're permitted to meet our highest day demands. And transmission distribution network similarly has to be able to deliver our total and our maximum day demands. It also has to be sized to be able to deliver those instantaneous demands in that peak hour that happens throughout the year. And so segmenting or functionalizing the cost to these systems is important so that we can take customer demands on an average day, maximum day, and peak hour basis to make sure that we're fairly allocating costs back to customers for each of those types of system functions that we have. And so we started this process looking at as granular a view as we could about the different types of customers on the county system with your billing data. And one of the things that's very interesting to look at is you look at month number 2 down here, which would really be February of 2019, you can see that the total system usage was a little less than 300,000 gallons or 300 million gallons for the month. But if you look at the peak month of June of that year, it was about 500 million gallons that month. Union County is not dissimilar from other utilities that have a high level of summer water usage for outdoor irrigation. And so you tend to see those peaks in water use during those points in the year from users that have a fair amount of, in particular, outdoor irrigation demands. And so that's part of what this whole process is trying to take into account is who's contributing to those peak demands, because we can't uninstall those elements of capacity even in those months of February and January and March when we don't have those demands, because we have to have that capacity there on a year-round basis once we've installed it. And so we went through the process of trying to estimate for different customer classes what those maximum day and peak hour contributions were based on that monthly data, and compared it back to some communities that we had actual data for per their advanced metering infrastructure as a basis of comparison to test these assumptions. And so we ultimately went through for all those individual customer classes that I mentioned, calculating peaking factors, if you will, or what's the ratio of maximum day demands to their average demands in the billing data for each customer class, and the ratio of the estimated peak hour demands by customer class as compared to their average demands. Because these ultimately were used to distribute those cost of the functions that I mentioned before to the individual customer classes. And ultimately that resulted in some pretty interesting takeaways for the water system. If we look at the test year revenue that we had for the system, that was about $31 million. But when we did the full cost allocation and split expenses between water and sewer, it found out that the actual cost of the water system was about $35.5 million. So it was about $4 million under the cost of service, which if you think back to some of those medians from the North Carolina Environmental Finance Center statewide report, you can see we were a little bit lower on water, below the medians, and a little bit higher on wastewater. This may be part of the explanation, is that we have a little bit of an imbalance from what we saw in 2020 between the water revenues and expenses. What was interesting is we did see that for the single family customer class, that there was a potential increase or potential difference, I should say, in the revenue in 2020 versus the cost of service being higher. And you can really see for each of those individual customer groups that we looked at, what the difference is in test year revenue, which is the orange bar, and the cost of service that we calculated in 2020. But we did place a bracket on this cost of service range, recognizing that we did have to make assumptions about what those maximum day and peak hour factors were by customer class. And so in the future, there could be variances against these cost of service results versus what's shown here on the screen, depending upon what actual observations you have in your system in the future that could come from investment in advanced metering infrastructure. But this is only really half of the equation from the cost of service perspective. The other half is on the wastewater side. And so here again, we followed a very similar by the book approach, following the industry practice in manual number 27 for wastewater, to distribute cost to each function and then allocate the cost of each of those functions back to customers based on how they contributed to them, based on flow, total suspended solids, biological oxygen demand, total phosphorus, even gone back and looked at some other things now, such as ammonia as well. But fundamentally, the outcomes on sewer were that, as you would expect, with water having test year revenues below the cost of service, in this case, the wastewater revenues are actually slightly above that same test year cost of service by the opposite amount. And you can see that the test year revenue for single family is at 22.8 million, but with the cost of service, that would be at 18.45 million. So the water chart was actually showing the opposite, where the orange bar was less than the blue, whereas here, the orange bar is greater than the blue. And so when you snap these two together, as many customers within the service area, not necessarily all, but many have both services, we wanted to kind of aggregate the two bars together so that you could see for single family as a whole, notwithstanding what's happening between water and sewer, when you have the two things together, it's actually showing a slight reduction or a small variance where the cost of service is less than the test year revenue being collected for single family. And you can see the results across each of the different categories of customers that we looked at throughout the analysis. And so this is, again, a snapshot in time. This is looking at singularly fiscal year 2020 revenues and revenue requirements. These things can and will change over time. And as we move forward and have conversations about future scenarios and capital investments, we will expect to see some changes in the nature of this cost of service complexion. They will change over time. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward is, as we get to some of those scenarios, it will, I think, ultimately have some bearing on how much do we want to consider and take into a stock for these cost of service results now, knowing what plan changes and investments we're wanting to make as an organization in the future and how it will impact these results. So from our perspective, we think this was a good approach to set up a framework to refresh something that hasn't been looked at in about 10 years. We do think that there will be some good updates to this, not only to the cost side in the future, but also with the advent of advanced metering infrastructure that can even give us some statistical samples to use to enhance those peaking factors. So we do think there are some good outcomes and results from this analysis from the cost of service perspective, and including the framework that can be used for future updates. One of the other parts that we looked at in the cost of service study was rate structure or rate design. And again, in this particular exercise, it's really a difficult job of balancing oftentimes competing objectives, trying to make sure that we're making sure that we have rates that are equitable, defensible, but also we want things that are simple, recognize the high level of fixed cost that we have on our system, but at the same time, provide a price incentive for conservation. So it's oftentimes a very difficult and different balance from community to achieve that type of a sustainable rate structure. But those are really oftentimes the competing objectives that we're trying to balance. And so as we looked at the rate structure as part of this cost of service evaluation, we did have some things that we'd identified for future consideration. The first would be to make sure that we recover customer-related cost in a customer charge that doesn't necessarily vary by meter size or number of dwelling units. To maintain the current level of fixed cost recovery that you have now, how much of your costs that you're capturing in your base rates is a reasonable level. You saw that from those median reports from the state. But we would also suggest some specific modifications for rates for each customer class, potentially creating a rate classification for multifamily, separating it into its own class, and there were a couple others that could be done as well. Update the uniform rates for all other customer classes and on the sewer side to reflect the current cost of service. But one of the things we did look at was potentially updates to the tiered water blocks and rate structure for single family to reflect typical usage profiles. And this would be something that I think when you do want to move forward with rate structure modifications would be good to look at and refresh periodically, because customer usage profiles do change to reflect the nature of water use efficiencies and fixtures at 37 gallons a day. It's kind of the current data that's out there in your household size to establish a reasonable basis for the first tier. Looking at larger families for indoor water use as a basis of the second tier. Looking at your actual distribution of single family lot sizes, which we did as part of this analysis. And then once you've looked at that distribution, to assess where do logical breakpoints exist for my customer base for outdoor irrigation, and being data driven in terms of how you assess that. So for you, we actually looked at some sampling, 200 different properties throughout the service area to identify how much of the parcel, that 10,000 square foot parcel or the half acre lot, had irrigable area. And on average, it was about 50% from that sampling survey of GIS information. And then formulaically saying, well, based on where we live and the types of grass that we have and how much irrigable area we have, how much water do we really need to irrigate that quarter acre lot and also for that half acre lot. And this would help you have a data-driven basis that's current for how you size your tiers. So at some point when it's time to have that conversation about the tier sizing, we think, again, the approach and the framework has been set up to give you a very solid foundation for having that conversation and evaluating potential changes on that in the future. So the last thing I have before I turn it back over to Hung to talk about some what-if scenarios is just on the current feasibility study that was in support primarily of the ADKIN. And so again, this part is really focused on the revenue requirements piece and how much revenue do we need to cover the identified system costs. And the purpose of this feasibility study was done to support that bond issuance. It's required by the local government commission as part of their evaluation and authorization of the issuance of the debt. And the added benefit of that is we get to refresh a great many of those assumptions that Hung pointed out in his slides that are important to evaluate and measure ongoing financial sustainability and financial planning for the utility. And so within the model itself, we did integrate the FY 2021 approved budget. It does include in the feasibility study the $32.7 million of YADKIN distribution improvements, in addition to $270 million for the plan itself, as well as an O&M allowance for that. It did not include anything for Lower Crooked Creek on the wastewater side, nor did it include the 12 Mile Creek potential expansion as part of the analysis. Some of the key assumptions that were in that feasibility study, we had a 2.8% annual system growth. And so again, this is growth on the utilities customer base, which may be different than the overall county population growth. So it's an important distinction to make. And it's about 1,760 new equivalent residential units per year. So we have to take all the different service types and sizes into account when we do the projections, whether it's residential, non-residential, multifamily, and express them all as equivalent residential units based on meter size. So that's not necessarily 1,760 new homes. That's the number of 1,760 new equivalent residential units is the forecast through 2024. We do have a wastewater capacity constraint included per discussions with staff. Without Lower Crooked Creek, it's a 25% reduction to our new ERUs starting in 2025. But some of the other key assumptions in the feasibility report have reflected past practice of the county and rating agency criteria, such as 365 days of operating reserves, reasonable levels of execution of our personnel expenses and our other O&M expenses based on recent historical trends, full funding of the identified capital improvement program, and also key debt service coverage ratios for our senior lien debt, our total rate covenant, but also for additional bonds tests. Some of these assumptions, particularly for reserves and debt coverage, are very important to the rating agencies. as they evaluate our creditworthiness. And so they help to give us a higher rating on the debt, which ultimately means a lower interest rate. So when we're talking about the magnitudes of borrowing that we are, these are very important to save on our interest expenses for the utility to allow us, again, to maintain a service as affordably as we can to our constituents. And so, as I mentioned on the ERUs, these are different size connections that we're converting to a common denominator. So again, these are not necessarily a number of new residential housing units. They're really calculated based on the flow capacity of the different meter sizes. So when we talk about how many equivalent residential units a 6-inch meter represents, they have 50 times the flow capacity of a normal 5/8 inch connection that's used for typical residential households. So one 6-inch meter would represent 50 equivalent residential units in this math. So I did just want to further clarify that for everyone's benefit. And this is the financial model that I think many of you have seen in the past for the utility that forecasts across the top the water rate plan as well as the wastewater rate plan. And below that, it shows our senior lien debt service coverage ratios, our rate covenant for all debt, our total additional bonds test, what our typical utility bill is. And the bottom graphs are things I just want to call your attention to in particular. We have 365 days of reserves. That's that black line going across the top left graph. The CIP funding in the bottom center graph, you can see there's a substantial amount in 2021, largely associated with Yadkin and that particular financing. And on the bottom right, we do have some additional borrowing identified, again, for the future for the utility as well. But all this is in the context of, back to the rate adjustments, 2.5% per year increases in fiscal year 22 to really keep pace with our anticipated inflation and provide us funding to address our future identified infrastructure, as I currently mentioned in those assumption inputs. And so, as was pointed out before, the national average annual rate increase for water and sewer rates across the country, that's that red line that ranges each year from typically about 3 to sometimes 7 or 8%. It averages about 5% per year if you look back 15, 20, or 30 years. But I think our forecast is very modest, as Hungman pointed out previously as well, in comparison to this trend. And it is something that's viewed favorably by the rating agencies as they, again, evaluate criteria in the financial health of the community. They do look at the level of future rate increases. They, it's a positive to them to have a stable trajectory on rates that doesn't have large adjustments. It's positive to them to see more smaller proactive increases and adopted multi-year plans versus large periods of time without rate increases. And, whether it's Moody's or other agencies, they've also highlighted for us that this type of sustainable planning on rates, but also reserves, how we're going to be issuing debt in the future. These are all things that weigh heavily in their minds in terms of how they're going to continue to evaluate us in the future. So we need to be mindful of these things and make sure we keep them in mind as we look at our spending scenarios to make sure we're hitting a lot of those key performance targets. And so the rate management piece, I just wanted to highlight again from Moody's scorecard. It's actually part of their published evaluation criteria, these rate practices. So again, being proactive, no constraints on the increases, that's going to get to almost a AAA rated utility, when you continue to adopt the levels of needed increases to maintain your system, meet your infrastructure and level of service objectives, but then also to hit those key performance indicators that I mentioned about reserves and debt coverage levels. So again, it's a very important part of how they evaluate your creditworthiness as a utility system. So with that, Hung, I think I'll turn it back over to you to walk through some of those what-if scenarios before, I guess, we open it up for discussion.
Before we move any further, Commissioners, I just wanted to ask if you had any questions for Andy about anything that he's presented.
I have one question. Is there any restrictions on using water revenue on sewer and vice versa? Is there limitations, or is it just utility revenues?
I think we treat it as utility revenue, but I think the industry practice is to sort of maintain that balance between the water revenue versus water cost, the cost of the business, and sewer revenue versus sewer cost of the business. Would that be fair, Andy?
Yeah, that would be fair, and that's why periodically you look at those things to try to keep them in balance, and it's not uncommon for them to periodically get out of balance. But then ultimately, as Hung just stated, you do want to try to make sure that you have, the rates covering the appropriate cost of service. But there's not a very specific and stringent, legal requirement about the frequency within which you do those types of analyses, nor when you make adjustments to account for necessary changes when you identify them.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Rushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The system development fees can only be used in the same basin. Is that what I heard you say earlier?
Yes, sir.
So are we going to charge a different system development fee for each basin because it would cost more to develop and build new infrastructure in one basin than the other?
No, sir, we are not. We have one system development fee rate, I guess if I can call it that. And the basis for that is a study that we conduct, I'll say every 5 years, to generate, what that rate ought to be, and then we put it before the board and depending on the methodology that you select, we set that as the rate for the next, I'll say 5-year period. Anything you want to add to that, Andy?
No, I think that's pretty fair relative to the methodology itself. Obviously, depending upon the method, there are restrictions on what types of expenses that you can use them for. But I think, defining a fee for the system as a whole is certainly something that you can do. I think relative to, the specific spending of the dollars, the biggest restriction is on which method you use, and the type of expenses you can use it for, relative to either future investment only if it's the incremental method, or historical investment, or really the lack of restrictions on your spending if you use, say, the buy-in method. So I think that's probably the biggest legal consideration I would point out, is the method that drives the types of expenses you can fund as opposed to the where.
So with that said, then I take it that the customer rates are not regulated to the basin in which they're in. So the
No, sir. Customer rates are customer rates, and they're revenue to the enterprise that we can apply to operating the business.
So we would use the customer rates to do the expansions, and that's where we're getting a lot of the income.
Yes, sir, to pay for the debt associated with running the business.
Okay. Now, there was no increase for all those years, from 1996 until
2000.
2000.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
11.
I'll put it
we
up.
build the Lancaster water plant? When did that start? What year?
That was 82.
89. And we did expansions and improvements there. When did we build 12 Mile Creek? When did it start? 94. Okay. So, and then through all those years, it strikes me as odd that we didn't have any increases until 2011. And 2011 is when the Yadkin project came on board, right? So we were preparing for when it started building up revenues for that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We're efficient, and you were saying earlier that we're very efficient with what we're doing.
Yeah.
But our rates are going up and up and up. Are we good cost managers of growth? Are we doing everything we can to make sure that we're not maybe growing too fast as a system, or why is it that our rates keep going up if we're efficient managers of money?
Well, I would say that we've learned to manage efficiently because, we just simply don't have, we're not flush with cash like what this graph shows you. So we've learned to operate very efficiently to get done the business of Public Works and run a very efficient and lean water utility. So we provide, good quality water with, basically as low as cost as we can possibly do it. At the same time, a lot of the pressures that we're seeing now, and it's what we talked about in January, are not operating pressures in terms of just regular ongoing business. How we don't have enough cars, or we don't have enough trucks or people to run the business. Mm-hmm. They're just capital infrastructure needs that we're running into, and that's what we're presenting before you. And at some point, you know, those needs are going to, you know, drive some of the decision that the board is going to have to make.
So when it comes to actual cost of providing the product to the customer, we're efficient.
I would say so, yes, sir.
So then the rate increases, then I'm assuming are to build cash reserves.
The rate increases are tied to the debt service payments or the capital infrastructure that we think we're gonna need to continue to maintain a quality water utility.
So is that accurate, building cash reserves to build future infrastructure?
It's some, I think there's some to that, because, but typically our rate increases just hit right before.
Yeah. Because it's not operating costs.
Yeah, we hit right, our rate increase typically hit right before the capital expense. If we knew, say, 10 years from now that we were going to build a wastewater treatment plant, to use that example, and we started a 2 or 3% rate increase above and beyond what we needed to operate to build the cash reserve so that come, you know, 2030, that we're not taking out a bunch of debt, but we're paying for it in cash, then yes, that's what we would be doing.
Okay. One last thing. I noticed on the hydrants, on the presentation that we were just given, hydrants are very low, but there's a low cost to use, I guess. Whereas for consumers, for residential, there was a high cost to use. We were doing, I think it was costing more than it cost to use, but when you looked at hydrants, it was, and when it's a very minuscule part of that, does that include like firefighting? Does that include agriculture use? What is that?
Andy, if you can you put that slide back up?
And it's hydrants. There was a slide, and I apologize, I moved away from the paper. It showed usage with residential, commercial. I believe maybe Wingate was on there.
Yeah, I think that was the cost of service analysis. It had
There.
Wingate on there.
That's it. I believe.
All
I
right,
think
you
it was
passed
the
it.
water. This-
Right there.
Okay, yeah, it's where it has hydrants. What would that include? Would that include an agriculture use or flushing the system or?
So the hydrant rates would be for, the bars are very small because there's not too many customers that have those hydrant meters out there. So a lot of times those are used during periods of construction, or that's probably the most common use. And so there's, again, just not too many of those, you know, quote, customers or meters out in circulation at any given time. But the cost include those associated with an allocation of our system average day, maximum day, and peak hour cost as part of the cost, in addition to just anything associated with a specific metering infrastructure itself.
Okay, and
So-
I guess.
So part of our cost would also be just sending out crews to maintain the hydrants, you know, paint them, maintain them, check them. And so we have crews that go, that, you know, that basically their entire job is to drive around the county and check all the hydrants.
Have we increased the fees for that lately? I had a call from a farmer, said that they got a meter and the fees were higher than.
Are you talking about a hydrant meter?
Yeah, it was a hydrant meter for agriculture use for spraying crops on fields.
We do not have a agriculture rate for hydrant meters. We have hydrant meters that we connect and they pay basically the general rate for water as a water customer.
So like at tiers, like if they went to.
Yes, sir.
So if they're using 10,000 gallons a month to spray fields, they would be paying like a residential customer rate.
Sorry, I wanted to clarify that they pay the non-residential rate. So anyone using the bulk hydrants, that is our bulk water program. You know, fire hydrant, you want to use the fire hydrant. You either use one of the bulk hydrants, which already has a meter set up on it, or in recent days, we've allowed for someone to request a meter. They pay what's called the non-residential rate. And it doesn't matter what customer you are. It doesn't matter whether you're a developer, doesn't matter whether you're ag. If you're pulling water out of that hydrant, you pay that rate per 1,000 gallons.
What is that rate?
Or
I believe it's 485.
45 per 1,000 gallons.
So about $5, yeah,
About
close to
$5 per 1,000 gallons.
Okay.
So
And-
anyone who pulls out of that, now in the past, it was all on an honor system.
Right.
You were required to turn in your records to show what water you used, and then we billed you for that. Now, we'll be honest with you, some people didn't give us their records. They got water for free. They
Right.
shouldn't have been.
Right.
But that's how our system worked. We didn't have a way to really make you accountable. We required you to actually tell us what water you used. We billed you for that.
So when a meter's on those hydrants, how is that accounted for? How do I know that I'm getting it versus the farmer down the road or the developer down the road?
Good question.
that's
You
good.
wanna answer that, Neil?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for giving me the opportunity to answer the question. Yeah, so on that, I think in the instances that you're thinking of, for that particular hydrant meter, we asked ourselves the same question. Well, how do we know who's taking the water? And so that farmer A isn't paying for farmer B's water. So we've set the hydrant up in such a way that the farmer A it's locked. And they have a key to the lock, and they're the only ones that can get water from that hydrant.
Okay.
Now, I want to clarify that on the bulk water hydrants, it is not that way. There is a meter on the bulk water hydrant. It is not locked so that anyone who has a bulk water permit can access that. We read the meter every month, so we know how much water is being pulled out of it. Obviously, what we're hoping is still on your honor system, that the records that come in from each of those users adds up the amount of water that's actually being taken out of that. In most cases, it doesn't, but it's still on your honor. That's the way that system works, because we can't have a key for every single bulk water user. It's just impossible for us to do that.
Do we flush hydrants still?
We do.
About how many is there a number of gallons that we flush through before we stop? Or?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Andy, I don't know if you know that number, but we've usually flushed
Just
hydrants.
for future, maybe
Okay.
I've thought of recapturing that water and letting the agriculture and development community use that. But listen, I'm not going to hold you up all day on this.
Okay, well, but we just generally flush hydrants at the end of a line where, it's
Right.
basically dead water just sitting there, and we just don't want it to go stale.
Right.
But we can try to get you that number of how much we flush a
Thank you.
year. The only other thing I'll say about the hydrants and the hydrant locks and the hydrant meters is it's not just the farmers, because it's also the fire departments that need access to that hydrant should they ever need to access that hydrant. So every time we put a hydrant meter or a lock on a meter, we have to go to every volunteer fire department and make sure every fire truck has a key to that particular hydrant as well and know how to operate it. So it is not easy to manage all that.
Okay. Thank you.
Fire departments aren't restricted to the blue top hydrants,
No,
right?
they can
They
use any
can pull
hydrant.
off any hydrant.
That's right.
But the blue tops are identified, they're the only ones that the commercial carriers or agricultural can pull off of. So if someone sees them just pulling off a standard fire hydrant, that's not authorized unless it's a,
That is not.
Fire
And-
truck.
And in some instances, we've actually put what we call hydrant locks on non-bulk water hydrants in areas where it's just tough to get eyes on that hydrant. So if somebody wanted to take water for free, they could do it without anybody watching. And so we put hydrant locks on it to prevent, and really what it is to prevent theft. And so again, every time we put a hydrant lock on, we have to notify the fire department and give them a key to it and make sure they know how to operate it. And Andy and his staff run that program.
and we'll have an opportunity at one of the later meetings to discuss that more in detail.
Yeah,
right?
that is the intent, sir, that we,
Okay.
once we get past April, we're gonna talk to you about bulk water.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Andy, and everyone else. So with that, I'm gonna get back to, now that Andy shared all that with you, where do we go from there? And so I just want to, as a transition, so I just want to remind you again, sort of what are the assumptions that Andy has taken into account in sort of developing the financial model for Union County Public Works. So we look at growth, 2.8% annual growth, and that's typical of what we've experienced in the past. The one thing I will say is that the sewer capacity constraint means that about 3 or 4 years from now, we've actually lowered that ERU number to, I think, about 1,400. Because we just don't have the sewer capacity. We've already permitted, and so we still expect those connections to come online for the next 3 or 4 years. But after that, because we are not permitting right now, we expect somewhere down the line that those connections aren't going to happen, so we expect a slower growth number. the operating reserves, and these are just some good financial practices that we have in place. And then, so with that, yes, sir.
I wanted to say something about that. I remember when I first came on the board, go back to the reserves. I thought, why do we need 365 days of operating reserves? Well, that was pre-COVID pandemic. And then the governor passes down an executive order that you don't have to pay your water utility bill, but you can't be cut off. So, you know, the pandemic taught me a lot of why we have to have these reserves. So basically what that's saying is this county is in a position to water and take sewer from these people for a year in the event of a pandemic. And I used to couldn't understand why do we need that much, but I see the wisdom in it now.
I appreciate your support, sir.
Young, just one other thing. That 2.8% growth, I know we're beginning water sewer master plan, and the board will be hearing about that, I believe, on March the 11th.
Yes, sir.
This 2.8% growth, I think it's important that, you know, the assumptions, the financial assumptions that are made here mirror what the consultants are using to develop water sewer master plans. So will that be the case that they'll be using these same assumptions for the other study as well?
Yes, sir. So, you know, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that all the data that we present to you, whether it's on an annual financial basis or a multi-year master plan, that they're all consistent. That's how we maintain our credibility. And so, you know, our work here informs our work on the master plan, and so we have all the consultants talking to each other to make sure that we're trying to get the best possible, you know, plan together about the future of, you know, Union County Public Works and the water utility and the sewer utility.
I think that's very important. You know, we have this. You're the hub of communication when it comes to the consultants that are working on the master plan, working with information that they get from this study, but in terms of being the conduit for that information, Public Works is it, and you're making sure that they're all using the same scorecard basically when they do this work.
Yes, sir. And not only that, we also talk with planning, because, you know, the county's comprehensive plan informs the work that we do. So we're also, you know, relying on the work of the planning department for our future plan.
Very good point. I'm glad you made that.
John, could I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
There was a slide in the previous presentation while you're on this point, on the annual growth, talking about key assumptions, and it referenced the fact that there would be a 25% reduction to 1,485 new ERUs relative to the Lower Crooked Creek.
Yes,
Can you elaborate on that just a little bit in terms of the difference in the ERUs and?
Yes, sure. Well, January, we presented to you the fact that, you know, our sewer system is capacity constrained. If you take all the actual flows and then you add in all the permitted flows and make the assumption, if all those connected, we're at plus 90% in a lot of our sewer treatment capacity. And the state has rules, when you get to 80 and when you get to 90, certain things have to happen. Right now, we have no plan for generating or building additional sewer capacity. We don't. And so if we have no additional sewer capacity, we cannot make those connections. And so we have permitted folks, developers, to connect, and so those people are working through the process, and they're building the neighborhoods and they're building the homes, and they'll be allowed to connect. But we are right now not permitting any new additional developments for future connections. And so the assumption is, in that what you just said, Commissioner Simpson, in that in the future, that the number of equivalent residential unit connections will be something less than what we're connecting right now. And so that's the impact of not having the sewer capacity.
Sir, are you saying we hit the 95% already?
No, well, we're at the, if you recall, in January.
92.8
Yeah,
is what it was.
Yeah, we're at 92, and we're close. So we're still doing work, nothing's come through in January, so there's no new development or permits that have made it through the process, so we're not there yet. I think we're scheduled to tell you again in March at the Ag Center event, sort of the status of that, but I'm just using that as an example. We're not making any new connections or permitting any new connections, once we get to the 95%.
Once we get to the 95?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what I was finding confusing.
Sure. So,
Commissioner Rushing?
but if everybody that has projects in the hopper came in and completed those projects, we would be over 100% at 12 Mile Creek and most other facilities that we
Well,
have.
So if everyone that's already permitted to connect to our wastewater system completed their project and connected, we'd be somewhere between 90 and 92% right now.
But if everybody who has
Yeah,
got
if-
approval.
Yes, sir. If all the other people that have submitted plans that have not been permitted were allowed to connect, yes, we'd be way over.
Yeah, so we're over what we've committed. The other thing, 7,000 people roughly per year is that 2.8% annual growth. That's population-wise, around 7,000 people per year. 2.8, does that sound correct?
Well,
That's not an equivalent population.
Right, but it's,
And I want you to be careful, sorry. Can I
Go
want
ahead.
you to be careful with that, because that is really a way of taking your sewer and water and sewer accounts and normalizing it. So it's taking commercial and it's turning it into an equivalent residential unit. So you can't say commercial flow equals people, so that, I wouldn't use that same number, that's
but,
not.
so the annual growth is not population growth?
That's correct, that's accounts.
What did we commit to the Environmental Management Commission? What kind of growth rate did we commit to them that we would grow at in Union County for the Yadkin Interbasin Transfer?
I do not know that number off the top of my head, and I'm staring at my screen, but I'm talking to you, Aubrey. I don't know if you know or if we did make any kind of commitment. And if we did, go ahead and speak up. If we didn't, or if you don't know, we'll try to get you that number.
Hung, this is Aubrey. I don't have that information handy, but we can get it.
Well, sir, if you
Would
don't
it be
mind,
safe
look
to
at-
say
yeah.
it's over 2% per year?
Probably, but we'll get you the actual number.
Okay.
Just to clarify again, this is Aubrey. There's a differentiation between the Catawba Basin and the Rocky River Basin, and they do range between, I believe, 2.4% and 3% over time in between the two basins.
Thank you.
Young, if I might, the 2.8% represents growth over the entire system.
Over the entire system, yes, sir.
So we know that all areas of the system do not grow at the same rate.
Yes, sir.
That some areas of our county grow at a much faster rate and some at a much slower rate. I'm really skipping ahead, but I would assume that in the master planning process, we are going to look at those areas which typically grow at a faster annual rate than others.
Yes, sir. In fact, we actually, on a whim, asked the consultants to create some maps for us with growth and our system overlaid on top of it. We sent it to Brian just for fun, but we will certainly share that with you.
Good. I look forward to seeing that.
I'm just gonna, before I move on, I'll just ask if there are any other questions.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you. So again, for us, in the baseline scenario, what we start with is our current budget. It's what you have approved. In addition to that, we have included almost $33 million for what I call the East Side Transmission Main Project. It's that line from the water plant down to Highway 74, sort of near Wingate. You've asked us to move that forward, so we've accelerated it from FY25 for design and FY27 for construction. So we moved it forward to FY22, and FY '24 for design and construction. So basically a 3-year acceleration. We've also included $270 million for the Yadkin Regional Water Supply Project. We had initially thought about doing this as 2 bond issuances because we just thought it would be easier for us to do it as 2. At the urging and guidance of the Local Government Commission, we did it as 1. They asked us to do it as 1. We looked at our numbers and we could do it. And so they asked us to do it. And so starting in FY '24, you're going to start to see the costs associated with Yadkin Regional Water Treatment Plan in terms of operating and maintenance, O&M costs, and then you'll see the debt service payments for that plant as well, sort of going into the future. They asked us, do it in one issuance, because that way it reduces the amount of uncertainty, the number of times you have to go to the market, and who knows what the rates are going to be 2 years from now, much less, right now. So we managed to make it work, and it was actually a good suggestion on the part of the the Local Government Commission. And so let me tell you what's not included. So in the baseline, sort of the baseline scenario, we have not included anything for Lower Cricket Creek. And that is a $120 million wastewater treatment plan project and related sewer improvements. If we were doing it, we would do the planning and design in '24. We would construct it in '26, and we would have it in operation by '28 with, annual ongoing maintenance costs going forward. We have not included any kind of expansion of 12 Mile. As you know, we just recently completed the expansion to 7.5. Our capacity numbers are suggesting that that capacity has already been consumed. So if you wanted to go to 9 MGD or 12 MGD, you can. And so from 7 to 9, it's about $26 million. And from 9 to 12, it's another $54 million. In terms of capital project costs, and there's obviously ongoing operating and maintenance costs.
Those are in today's dollars?
Those are, yes, sir, I think in today's dollars. And if you're wondering, well, why is the first, well, it's 7.5 to 9, so that's $1.5 million, and the 9 to 12 is 3 MGD. So you sort of get a feel for why the costs show up the way they do. We also have not included anything for the east side, simply because we just don't have any plans on the east side. So that study is underway. It's nearing completion, so we'll have a better idea of what's possible on the east side in terms of sewer need, sewer demand, as well as, what our alternatives are and what it would cost to implement any of those alternatives. As it stands, we have an ongoing relationship with the city of Monroe for their sewer, where we use their sewer treatment plant to treat our wastewater. They currently had, up until recently, their expansion plan was for 2030. So they were going to do their next expansion at 2030, and we were in partnership with them, and so we were going to expand our sort of usage at that time. So whatever we get from Monroe, we pay for. So if it's a 5 MGD expansion and we want to buy an additional 1 million gallons, it would be a 6 MGD expansion, and we would pay for the capital cost of that additional MGD. So recently they've said that they're looking at accelerating their own project by 3 years. So their 2030 project is now a 2027 project, and in 2027 dollars, that would be about an $80 million project, because we would be buying close to 5 MGD. The big sort of takeaway there is their current wastewater treatment plant, at some point, they are going to have to decommission. And so they have to build, they're not building an increment, they're not going from an 11 MGD plant to a 15 MGD plant. They're having to build a 0 MGD plant to a 15 MGD plant, and we are going to have to pay for our share of it. So if we want to buy 5 MGD, we got to pay for our proportion of cost, capital cost. If we want to buy more or less, it's going to impact our cost. Right now, that's what we have in the master plan from 2016, and that's what we're showing as part of our options to the board.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Ms. Rushing.
Question on number 1 on the Lower Crooked Creek. It's got a FY 2024 planning and design, 2026 construction, and 2028 operation. If we started that today, if we started I know that we're gonna be discussing later in the year, purchasing land, I think, and beginning the process. Even if we did that, I don't think that those numbers are accurate. From what we've heard, those numbers are not accurate. It would be, Brian, correct me, 8 years before we could get permitting completed?
We anticipate, and again, I know there's always.
Might want to come up to the microphone.
We anticipate that it takes about 8 years from start to finish to have a plant operational. So if you started today, that's 2029. So that's if everything goes smoothly and perfectly. We all know things don't always go smoothly and perfectly. But in a perfect world, we'd be able to have our permitting done in roughly about 5 years. We have design and construction, and that puts us at about 8 years of the time that you actually have it operational.
And that's if no lawsuits.
That everything is perfect.
So we could be looking at 2030, 20.
You could certainly add time to that, absolutely. We're giving you best case scenario.
That also applies to anything we did with Monroe as well, right?
Absolutely, that's a good point. If we built, I'm not saying you would, but if you built your own plant on the east side, you'd have the very same scenario there. We'd estimate 8 years. It may take longer. It's all going to depend on what the environmental issues are, any other permitting problems you may run into. So we estimate 8 years.
Now, the city of Monroe, you said something interesting. You said that they would have to start from zero. They're going to decommission the plant that they have, which is currently at 10 million or 12 million?
It's about an 11. We'll split
11
it.
million gallon MGD. So when they decommission, does their permit not transfer to whatever they're using?
Yes, sir, but they're also looking to expand the permit capacity. So
Right, but so they're still asking for an expansion of a plant capacity, the permit, what's permitted to flow in that creek. They're not asking for an additional 11 to 15 million gallons. They're asking for
an increment above 11.
an
So, yeah,
increment
11 to,
of
say
the
11 to
million
15 or
gallons that they
11 to
already have.
16. Yes, sir.
Right.
I think the important thing that Young was trying to point out is that the costs are going to be a lot higher than an expansion.
Right.
Because you're building
not
a
the
new,
permitting.
yes, right, you're building a new facility, but you still are expanding the permit limits.
Right.
That's the goal.
Right.
I'd also like to ask that, and I don't want it right now, because I'm sure you'd have to go back and get it, cost differential, what it cost us to run our plant per gallon, and what Monroe charges us, because the cost of the plant is only a piece of it. I'm sure they're good partners, but there's generally uplift when you sell something.
Certainly.
Out of all, since we're talking about it, I'll tell you, out of all of these options, the 12 Mile is the only place where we're permitted to 12 MGD. We have the land, and we can actually build today. Anywhere else, whether it's on the east side, Lower Crooked Creek, you'd have to go through the permit process before you can do anything else. And the last thing I'll mention is, again, I'll say it again, we're going to talk to you about the master plan process in March, early March. And we're going to, obviously it's too early in that process to talk to you about sort of what's all in the master plan and how that's taken into account. But that is a process we're going to kick off with you, and we're certainly going to make sure that you're involved and your input is considered as part of whatever comes out of that process. And so, obviously we can't take into account something that doesn't exist yet, but that process is underway. So I want to then show you, so with all that, with all those assumptions, with our starting point, sort of what are we looking at? So the baseline scenario, as we're calling it, shows you from 2021 to 2031. So I'm showing you sort of right now plus 10 years. Our current rate this year was a 15.5% increase. Going forward, to make the model work, you're looking at 2.5% rate increase every year going forward to 2031. That's sort of what the model looks at, based on all the assumptions that we have made. There are 4 sort of scenarios that I'm going to share with you on top of that. So it's 1A and B, 2, 3, and then sort of, if we did it all, what would that look like? I recognize that you can mix, so I look at it this way. It's like almost like an a la carte menu. You can pick and choose what you want, if you want, or you can choose none of it, it's up to you. Or you can choose all of it. So again, it's up to you. So we wanted to give you some options to sort of give you a feel for what it looks like if you decided to do certain things. This is not the totality of options, because you could say, well, do 1B plus 3. And that is not something that we've considered or done the math on, and we would have to go back and do that. So, this, again, the base, 15.5 in 2021, 2.5% rate increases going forward. If you wanted to expand 12 mile from 7.5 MGD to 9, and then work your way to 12 sort of concurrently, you're looking at, I'll start just with 2022. It would add a 0.25 percentage point to the rate. So going forward from 2022 to 2031, your rate increase would be 2.75, not 2.5. If you chose, and what that means is, you're doing the construction work, you're gonna design from 7.5 to 9, so take a year to design it, take a year to build it, and then you're gonna go from 9 to 12, take a year to design it, take a year to build it. So you're doing that concurrently, so that's what that gets you. Option 1B is if you decide, you know what, let's just skip 9, let's go right from 7.5 to 12. If you decided to do that, what you're looking at is 2 years of 5.5 and then down to 2.75. Option, I'll say scenario 2, option 2, is if you decided you wanted to actually build Lower Crooked Creek wastewater treatment plant. What that gets you, what that looks like is 5 years of 4.25, and then you go down to 2.5. And this is not, these are not cumulative or additive. You're not doing 1A, 1B, and then adding 2 on top. This is if you just do Lower Crooked Creek and nothing else. It is 4.25 through 2026, and then 2.5 thereafter. And then if you decided to do none of that, and you just wanted to do the east side and do something on the east side, based on sort of what that Monroe number looks like, right now we have it in at 3.5. I'm sorry, 3. It would basically add half a point, a half a percentage point to that rate. So if you wanted to do all of the above, so you know what, what's it look like if we bought everything? So if you wanted to really, transform the sewer infrastructure, and this is what it would take, 6.5% through 2026, and then 2.5 thereafter. Again, I'm not making a play here for anything. If you ask me for my opinion, I'll give it to you in March, because that's what the schedule calls for. But right now, I just wanted to show you some options as a sort of what these options look like, what the rate impact might be. On the previous slide, I showed you, well, I think 2 slides ago, sort of what it costs to have these projects. And here, you can just sort of get some, what I call rate sensitivity. If I do this project, this is what the rate's gonna be. If I do this project, this is what the rate's gonna be.
Young, this takes into account not only the capital infrastructure, but also O&M
Yes, sir, everything.
costs.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Yee, I remember our presentation in November of 2019 where you were talking about what the rate increases would be in the future. And I seem to remember 2.5%, 3% rate increases year after year on that slide, and that was including the $122 million for a northern sewer plant.
Yeah, I do remember that slide, and it showed 2.5, it actually showed 2.5s going out through the next 10 years after
Right.
the 15.5.
So now, and I'm no fan of the Lower Crooked Creek project, and I'm not going to support it, but now I see it's going to 4.25.
Well, I'll say,
I don't mean to interrupt, but the Lower Crooked Creek was not included in that rate projection because it hadn't come up on.
Wait 1 second. No, it was included because it was in the $905 million worth of projects. So it was included in that project, and it was talked about during that project. And matter of fact, I pointed it out at that time, and the assumption is that the 2 large increases would cover the cost of the Yadkin and would cover the cost of future projects ongoing, because it was such a drastic increase. and that it really wouldn't have an effect one way or the other. And if you wouldn't mind pulling those slides back out when you come back for your presentation, I just want to make sure we're comparing that correctly.
Sure.
Because my memory could be shaky.
No, you're right. I can see the same slide in my head. I had a top line
Oh, I
where it
can
showed
too.
2.5. The other thing that I'll tell you about that chart was, it was grayed out. So if you could see if you remember, the transparency was grayed out, because the other thing was that we think it's gonna be about 2.5, but it's so far in the future, we're not sure. And as farther we go out, the less certain we are. And so we think it's gonna be 2.5, but we graded out to give ourselves some room for uncertainty. The other thing that I'll say before, I apologize, Commissioner Brushing, is a lot's changed since November 1999, I guess, and today.
2019.
And one of those things that's changed is the sewer capacity constraints and what we're looking at in terms of the system growth. All of that's factored into this model. And so we're not looking at the growth. And I don't know how big a role that has in sort of what we're looking at, but I would say a lot has changed since the last time that November retreat. We have a lot better information today than we did back then, and these are the best numbers we got right now.
Well,
Before you go forward,
Can I
please.
point out some things? Because you're right, that was shown on there, but it was grayed for the future because we didn't know. The east side transmission line was not included in that. So there was 30+ million that was not included in that rate model. So I want you to understand that they had to kind of go back and regroup. So that 30-some million was not in there. That had to be refactored in there. Obviously, when you do rate projections, we're not perfect. I mean, I'm going to tell you that in 2027, it probably won't be 3% or 2.75. We're making guesses right now.
And I don't expect you to be perfect.
Sure.
And please don't,
No.
the point that I'm making is as 5 decision makers up here, there's going to be maybe 5 different decision makers when these bills come due.
Sure.
And if those 5 different decision makers have to raise rates 6% or 7%, then it would be better for us to get ahead of this now and make sure we have the least impact on the future, not the most impact on the future. And once we get started, this is a battleship. It's not easy to turn around.
The train doesn't stop easily.
It's
You're
not a
right, sir.
speedboat, yeah, it's a battleship, and you just can't, so we have to get on it from the beginning, and that was my concern about using the $30 million to take the water to Rocky River Road pump station to pump it there. I thought it would be better spent taking it to Wingate first and then putting it into the distribution system. So it's an either-or thing sometimes, but now we've already approved that, and it's already happening, and it's already under construction, and it's already been budgeted. So would that $30 million have been better spent taking it to Wingate to our water tank? Yes, it would have. But we need to make those decisions again, based on these numbers. They're going up with every decision that we make. So it's even more important that the 5 of us make wise decisions on the front end of this, rather than 5 commissioners in the future having to make decisions to raise rates higher and higher and higher when the people are already screaming that it's too high.
Before we go any further, I'm going to ask Manager Watson if you'd like to finish your statement.
What Mr. Yu was saying just a second ago about it being so far out into the future, my recollection, Commissioner Rushing, was that Lower Crooked Creek project was so far out in the future at that time that it had not been calculated into the rate increase there. But I could be wrong about that, and but now you kind of brought that up. Now I'm curious about what it actually looks like. I'm have to go back and take a look, but I was thinking it was so far out in the future that it hadn't been calculated in.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, just,
No,
we'll go
I'm
back.
sorry.
I
I'm sorry.
actually think it was.
November,
but we'll-
November 2019 was a turning point of this board, and I tend to remember those dates, and
You got a good memory. I know you
I've
do.
got a decent memory. I'm getting older, but I'm
No.
still holding on to a little bit of it.
We'll verify, but I think
Thank
it
you.
was, but I don't think it may have been to the level, because we may have
All
had
right.
different cost estimates at that time. And also, we did not have the east side part of it as well.
Yeah, that was added.
that's
The
right.
the east side, $30 million
It's about 32.
transmission
33
line to
million.
take it to the water
That's
plant
right.
was not
Yeah,
included.
That was not in that,
Right.
in that one, so.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so we were just talking, we'll make sure when we come back to you in March that we have I'll just call it a compare contrast chart between what did we show you in 2019, November, versus what we just show you, what we're just showing you right now. So, yeah, so Mr. Rushing, we'll have that for you.
Thank you.
I'd like a little more, not today, when you come back on the 11th, because what I see that the various projects, there's short-term and there's long-term. I don't want to be sitting in future years by us not taking action on long-term and have to suffer the consequences we're going through right now because in mid-2000s, the board did not take action to provide resources. So I'd like to, you know, your thoughts on short-term, long-term, and impacts March the 11th.
Yes, sir. We'll be ready to share that with you in March. I got, I think, one last slide to show you, and that is sort of time-wise. So I've shown you sort of what it is that we're talking about, sort of what the cost would be, what the rate impact would be, and the last thing I'm going to show you is sort of so how would this work in terms of time-wise? And in fact, I'm just going to put it all up. So 12-mile option A, you know, it's the design, construct, and you can see how that goes. If we started, it would start in 2022 and go all the way out to 2030. That's how long it would take. And I think I was wrong. I said 1 year. These are 2-year blocks of time. 2-year design, 2-year construct, 2-year design, 2-year construct. If you did it all at once, you'd have a 2-year design and then a 3-year construct. So, you know, the material difference there, it'd save you a year and a half, or I'm sorry, 3 years in terms of having, you know, capacity up to 12. Lower Crooked Creek, again, we're showing you, we'd have to spend some amount of time doing permitting, then design and then construct. City of Monroe, our best guess right now is they're looking at doing design in 2025, construct in 2027. What we do know is right now that the city's going to spend at least a year looking at doing some studies to figure out, you know, they got this old wastewater treatment plant, they're going to build a new one. Is there a way to do it so that they don't have to bite the apple all at once? I don't even think that's a metaphor or a simile. If they eat the apple, the whole thing, swallow the whole thing all at once. In fact, just do it in piecemeal and sort of reduce cost to them and reduce cost to us over time and just sort of phase it in over time. So they're going to spend some time just studying that option, and they need to hire somebody a group of engineers to actually look at those, what their best cost option is for them in terms of how they do their wastewater treatment plant expansion. So if you look at all these, the earliest we could have any kind of capacity relief is 2026. You say short-term, but there really is no short-term option if you're looking for something this year. Any kind of alternative in terms of making a decision about the future really is at least a 3-year process. If you said go today, go do all of it, for example, it would take us 3 years to get new capacity into our system. That's how long it takes to design. That's how long it takes to construct. There really is no short-term option. So the best thing I'll say to you is I'll give you a midterm option. What can we do in 3 years versus what is it going to take between now and 2030 to get capacity relief in our sewer system? So that's February. And in March, we're going to come before you and just share some other fees. We didn't think we'd have time for it today to take you through what we call miscellaneous fees. It was that $7 or $8 million number that we showed you, or actually I think it was a $4 million number. Talk you through a little bit more about system development fees, and really the decision there is the next study is 2 years from now. Do you want to do it 2 years from now, or do you want to do it sooner in terms of looking at what our options there are? And then lastly, all the information you've asked for, we will bring to you back in March, and we'll also bring to you a recommendation on midterm options and longer-term options in terms of what we can do in the system. And then lastly, in April, we're going to come back to you again, and we're going to ask you for some decisions. And a key one there is going to be rates. What rates do you want to set for the next 3-year period? And that, in turn, drives what we're going to be able to do system-wide in terms of infrastructure, in terms of improvements to keep providing service to our customers. So that is it. That's all I got, sir. Board, if there's any questions, happy to take
Any
them.
questions?
Mr. Chairman, Young, would you go back?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sir.
That east side improvements that's there on the City of Monroe expansion, I know we're currently under contract with them for certain MGD.
2.65.
2.65 in their plant. That contract with the City of Monroe also has some provisions about, you know, sharing capital improvements in the plant.
Yes, sir.
If the City of Monroe decides to decommission their entire plant and build a new plant, and we are reliant upon 2.65 of the capacity, we've already made capital investments in the current plant. I would like to know, and I think the board would like to know, and it would probably be better to know sooner than later, and perhaps March would be your March
Sure.
meeting would be a good time for this. And I would imagine that we need to ask our attorneys to really look at that agreement and so that the board has a clear understanding. You know, if they expand the current plant, that's one thing, you know, making a capital investment in a plant. But if we build a new plant, we've already made a capital investment in one plant. I assume we're going to be asked to make a capital investment in the new plant for the same capacity we've already paid for. And then if we ask for additional capacity, we're going to be possibly asked to pay more. We would be asked to pay more for capital or for the cost to construct new capacity. I think that's very important for this board to understand what our commitments are, contractual commitments are to the City of Monroe for the capacity we have today, and what that will mean if a new plant is constructed in the future. And as I look at your previous slides that talk about the amount of, what was it, like $80 million?
Yes, sir.
That was for the five, right?
So it's almost 2.65 plus 2. That's
Okay,
what
so I think we need to refine whatever that is, whatever that number is. I think the board needs to understand, because if we're in a contract with the City of Monroe and they decide to do this, you know, what are our options? If it is to continue to use the capacity in that plant, then there's not going to be an option about how much that really costs. We're not necessarily in the driver's seat about what the cost is going to be. It is going to be a cost that is incurred, though, and we need to understand what that is and when that may come due, because that will impact these rates, and I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of say-so over that particular factor. But I think this board needs to understand more about what that is before we get too much further down the road.
Yes, sir. We can try to be ready in March.
Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ray?
One thing I did want to say, I know sitting up here trying to remember 2019, it does kind of make you sit here and you think and you try to remember, and it just makes you think, reminds you how old you are. And I've always said my children taught me to never say never. But the one thing that I've heard from this dais many times was that high-density development pays for itself. And I'm beginning to believe it doesn't. So I think when we talk about all that other stuff, we also need to keep in mind that maybe what we used to think is not true.
And I think where, you know, high density as far as paying for itself, it's more, I guess if you're gonna have high density growth, if you're gonna have growth, the less land you take up, the better, and it pays for itself for the builder, especially because they have to pay less roads, less movement. It probably saves water, because we saw today the water usage on a quarter-acre lot is less than the water usage on an acre lot for irrigation of lawns. But the biggest thing that we're finding out is that the customers are subsidizing development in Union County because the ratepayers are paying for the development of new infrastructures. So as long as the customers are going to be subsidizing that, then we need to be very cautious in how we proceed in building new stuff. We wouldn't buy new equipment that we couldn't afford to build in our business, or we would go bankrupt. So I think we need to be very careful in what we pick and choose to build. There are some obligations we have to meet, but we definitely don't have to meet the obligations that's been put forward to us.
Sir, we are done.
We appreciate your time and your presentation and your staff's support.
Well, thank you. It was our pleasure to be in front of you, and I want to just, again, thank Andy and his staff at Stantec for all the partnership that we have. It really is a great partnership, and sometimes I worry that we're taking advantage of Andy and his folks in terms of what we're asking them to do, but they've been fantastic to work with. And I just want to thank you again, Andy and Leticia and Jacob, for your time today on being with us and with the Board of County Commissioners on this topic.
Tom, you're too kind. It's our pleasure to help. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, so with that, I'm going to sign off, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
With that conclusion, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn our special meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you.